Joining me now is retired four-star Army General David Petraeus, the former CIA director, of course, and head of Central Command. Thank you very much for being with us, General Petraeus. It's great to see you again. So talk to me about the battleground and how significant is what Stoltenberg is announcing in terms of NATO bolstering its eastern flank.
Well, I think it's very important, Andrea, because this really reflects NATO's big response to the new dynamic, which is a much more threatening Russia. And moving essentially the front of NATO, the main focus of NATO, all the way out to the Baltic states and to the Eastern European limits of NATO's borders. And of course, also very significant is what's happening on the Ukrainian battlefield, where the Ukrainians, by and large, have stopped the Russians short of achieving their objectives, especially around Kyiv and Kharkiv, although they obviously are still tightening the noose on Mariupol in the south. But the Ukrainian local counterattacks that are being conducted outside Kyiv are very significant because it's the signs of the Ukrainians pushing the Russians back, getting them out of artillery range that can hit downtown Kyiv, and a very clear demonstration that the Russians are not going to achieve what it is that they were seeking on the battlefield, at least around the capital and the second largest city, Kharkiv, even if they are still making some progress in the south, although they've experienced a lot of challenges there as well. And then if you look at the strategic, the battle of attrition that is going on in a sense between Kyiv on the one hand, President Zelensky, and Moscow and President Putin on the other. President Zelensky watching as, even though his forces have stopped the Russians pretty cold, still the destruction of the Ukrainian cities and infrastructure and innocent civilian lives continues. And then Vladimir Putin, who is watching as his economy, his financial system, his friends, his oligarch buddies are all being seriously damaged. And as over 400 U.S. companies have either ceased their operations, left Russia, or at least put everything on hold for now. And with the knowledge that his forces on the battlefield aren't achieving what they are seeking to do, what they were seeking to do, really, that they have culminated, if you will, and that there is, to be sure, a bloody stalemate, but a stalemate nonetheless, perhaps there could be an awareness that on each side, there should be a willingness to accept a compromise that is something that was unacceptable to either prior to the beginning of the invasion.
In this war of attrition and this stalemate, can you see Putin ever backing down and accepting a compromise, even though we've been reporting that his troops are lacking in fuel and food and other supply lines and don't have night vision goggles and are even suffering frostbite? So
they're experiencing all kinds of difficulties that should not be the case at all in a professional military. And it really highlights, frankly, how unprofessional various elements of the Russian military are. It reminds us that 20 to 25% of the troops in the battlefield are conscripts who only serve 1 year. And by the way, their conscription was supposed to end in April, and he has extended those tours. You can imagine what that does to morale on those troops' minds and so forth. So, and you've seen the totally inadequate command and control, the totally inadequate logistics. Even the campaign design was wildly unrealistic and reflected a total lack of appreciation for the Ukrainian strengths, determination, capabilities, and so forth. I mean, again, even he has to recognize that this campaign is going to fall short of what it hoped it would achieve. Certainly on each side, is still trying to achieve a degree of momentum, perhaps a degree of progress on the battlefield that could translate into a bit on the negotiating table that would give them an edge. But my sense is that the Russians can't replace the enormous number of casualties they've taken. They can't reconstitute units that have basically been rendered combat ineffective. And that as that seeps in Moscow, and as he sees the ruins of the financial system and the damage to the economy, and again, his oligarch friends, that there might be a recognition that it is time to get what might be achievable, what could be perhaps presented as some kind of success, if you will, that was worth all this bloodshed. As on the other side, President Zelensky, who will also wisely submit whatever it is that he is going to agree to a referendum in the country, so the whole country buys into the compromises that will be necessary. Perhaps all of this can come together and finally bring about a ceasefire, a phased withdrawal of the Russian forces, perhaps the introduction of OSCE peacekeepers or observers or something along those lines, and bring this terrible bloodshed and destruction to an end.
Before leaving the White House on his way here, President Biden warned that there's a real threat that Putin could use chemical weapons. What should the U.S. do if he uses chemical, biological, or even, it was discussed at NATO today with Stoltenberg, nuclear weapons?
Well, I think what the U.S. has done is appropriate, also what Secretary General Stoltenberg has done, and that is, frankly, to issue a very, very significant warning to Russia, to put them on notice that the results would be very, very severe. It's unwise, I think, to try to get into speculating what severe would mean in a particular case, because we don't know what the particular case is. The hypotheticals are just too numerous and too complex to try to, again, craft what it would be. But there's a whole toolbox full of responses that will be put together, I'm sure. I'm very confident that the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, and his team have sketched out what might be possible alternatives and options to put in front of the president if that comes about. Again, the hope would be that this is such a significant threshold that even Vladimir Putin, even if he is feeling somewhat cornered, that he'll still recognize that there is more left to lose. We never want him to feel that there's nothing left to lose, because then the consequences could be very grave. But as long as there is something still out there, perhaps that can be avoided. And again, perhaps there can be some kind of negotiated conclusion to this terrible tragedy.
General Petraeus, thank you so much. It's very good to hear.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Hear your perspective. Thank you.